Well, hi everyone. Several of you reached out to me and asked me to cover the Los Angeles area fires that have been going on for the last few weeks. Initially, I didn't want to wade into it because it seemed like most of the early discussions were around politics, and I was waiting to think more through it, and I realized there definitely is engineering aspects of this story that really need to be discussed, and I haven't heard much of any discussion of them. So that's what I'm going to bring to you all today. I'm recording this video on Wednesday, January 22nd. And one of the immediate dangers that I want to go into before I go into the main theme of this video is the impending risk of, due to the denuded landscape and typical higher precipitation amounts in the winter. In fact, there's rain forecasts for Los Angeles area this coming weekend. But just to give you an overview, there are many areas throughout Southern California, the Pacific Palisades fire, the Easton fire, and then many buildings, homes were destroyed in Malibu when the fire jumped the Pacific Coast Highway. But it's just utter devastation. This is going to be the most costly disaster that's occurred in the United States in maybe ever. I think it's potential that we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in property damage. And of course, California periodically has these fires that are quite often destructive to some number of homes, but we're talking thousands of homes destroyed at this point. So yeah, the mud flow risk is from all these areas that have been burnt to vegetation, leaving exposed soil. And this is footage of previous mudslides. It can knock buildings right off their foundations. Tremendously destructive. People can get engulfed by the debris flow. It's quite dangerous. And quite messy, to say the least. There's another mud flow that was caught on video. Often see large trees, tree trunks, and that sort of thing being carried along with the mud flow, debris flow. So thanks to Eric, a channel viewer who pointed out this resource to me. It's the U.S.G.S. post-fire debris flow hazards. They've got a link where they've got various areas mapped out showing the potential risk for these mud flows. I've got a link to this resource in the description if you want to check it out. So let's just bring up this map here. We can see the dark red areas that are high hazard at this point. So we're talking about the Palisades fire that set up the potential for mud flows in these areas pretty much throughout the whole Palisades and Malibu area. Let's look at the Eaton fire in the Altadena area, and you see pretty much that entire area is at high risk for mud flows. Now I mentioned there's a lot of political aspects to this story. I'm really not going to delve into it. I mean, clearly those aspects need to be investigated, but from a system-wide perspective. So a lot of people are talking about an empty reservoir. Apparently this reservoir was undergoing maintenance. Other people have talked about using or installing piping systems so that seawater can be pumped from the ocean, much as they have in San Francisco. But to me, these issues are important, but they don't address the big picture here and what really needs to be done. Because frankly, the system, as you want to call it that, for fire protection in Southern California has primarily relied upon active intervention through firefighting. People on the ground digging fire breaks, planes and helicopters dropping loads of water on fire zones and that sort of thing. And I want to take a different approach in this video. Now, a lot of people are upset with various insurance companies, including State Farm, for non-renewal of coverage or cancellation of coverage for many homes in this area months in advance. And quite frankly, you know, I'm not a big fan of insurance companies, but it's a business and people need insurance in most cases. So I think collectively, people need to figure out what it's going to take for insurance companies to offer coverage at the best possible rates in California and not just try and impose these draconian measures, which I don't think is going to work. But really, this was the canary in the coal mine. People should have been asking, what do the insurance companies know that either the homeowners or the state of California officials apparently don't know? And the shorter answer is the insurance companies apparently told the state of California. I mean, there's a big insurance commission there that regulates the insurance industry in that state. And these insurance companies told them exactly what the issues were. Problems with water supply, a number of crews available who could do firefighting, lack of consistent and effective management of woodland areas, scrub, that sort of thing. And the other thing is, most of these homes were built decades ago in accordance with older building codes. So there's less protection relative to fire resistance in these older codes as compared to modern codes. And that's one of the aspects I'm really going to focus on here in this video. So let's just look at this area. This is the Pacific Palisades area. You can see the red outline and just see some images here of these fires, just really devastating. And one of the aspects that people have mentioned here, which is quite interesting, they've been talking about the vegetation that's caught on fire, and it's these blowing embers from the vegetation that get on these homes, and then a lot of the fuel for the fire then comes from the homes themselves. I mean, these are typically wood construction, wood frame homes, flammable siding, flammable roofs, flammable vegetation nearby the home. And you just see these scenes of complete devastation. So there's a current California building code, and of course this applies to new construction. Or if you have a big enough renovation to an existing home, then newer codes could apply. But in the codes, there's items that cover what kind of roof coverings you should have, what kind of exterior walls you should have, how you should create fire breaks with regard to vegetation around your home, and just making other aspects of the home flame and ember resistant. I just want to read this little excerpt here. For a house to qualify for fire insurance in fire-prone areas of California, it would need to meet specific criteria related to its construction materials, surrounding vegetation management, what they call a defensible space, and potentially additional features like fire-resistant roofs, ember-resistant vents, and properly sealed eaves, allowing insurance companies to assess the property as having a lower wildfire risk and therefore making it eligible for coverage. If the house doesn't meet these standards, it may only be able to obtain a policy through the California Fair Plan, which offers limited coverage at a higher cost. I think I've heard that the maximum coverage under the Fair Plan is maybe 60% of the home value. So let's look at these key factors that affect insurability for a home relative to fire risk. You've got construction materials, again, defensible space, ember-resistant features, and vegetation management. Seems pretty straightforward. And I'm not saying it's cheap to implement these measures, but look at the alternative. I mean, the hundreds of billions of dollars in property damage, the undoubted loss of taxes through decreased property values, impacts to businesses. I mean, the economic implications just magnify many times beyond just the actual property damage. And there's some features of the California Fair Plan here for insurance if commercial insurance companies won't provide coverage. I live in an area that's got a nearby city that still allows cedar shake roofs. And I've got a modern composition roof on my home, and I still worry every 4th of July that some yahoo's going to shoot off a bottle rocket and have it land on my roof and have it catch on fire. I can't imagine living in an area prone to wildfires. So I think calling these types of events natural disasters implies, an act of God or something that humans had no way to prevent or control, and that's just not true. Obviously, there are many things that governments and individuals could and should be doing to reduce these fire risks. What's one thing that could be done? Using concrete roof tiles. This is better in terms of fire resistance than certainly any type of wooden roof or composition roof. You could use fiber cement siding. This is a demonstration of a fire that was set next to a house that had cement fiber siding, and you could tell it's just got scorched, but the material itself did not burn. So yeah, let's look at why these fires are so dangerous and why they spread so much. You know, you got these embers blowing around and they can be carried miles from the front of the fire. So here's a side-by-side comparison of, say, a house with wooden siding versus one with the cement fiber siding. I'll play that here. You see the embers blowing onto the house. And the non-protected side is quickly engulfed in flames. It's rather dramatic. Now, there's other systems that can be employed. These dousing systems are basically like lawn sprinklers, but for your roof and siding. And I understand some people had these installed on their homes in these Southern California fires, and it saved many of them. See here, it's not only covering the house itself with water, but also the vegetation within a distance of several feet of the home. So again, I am looking at this from an engineering perspective. Clearly, the insurance companies are better at assessing risks and pricing it than anybody in state or even federal government. So they should be listened to. They should be brought to the table and say, okay, go down the list of what you want to see so that you can offer insurance and hopefully at affordable rates for these fire-prone areas. It's not going to be enough to say that these companies are evil and they need to be punished. I mean, it's a business, and they made a business decision to not incur hundreds of billions of dollars in losses if they could help it. So again, it should be a huge red flag if they're not willing to provide coverage. What are the root causes and what can be done to eliminate or mitigate those concerns? Think of it like the Northridge earthquake. This was in 1994, January of 1994. It was a 6.7 magnitude quake. I was actually out there starting a couple of days after this earthquake to do a project in Southern California for several months, and I experienced some of the 5.2 and greater aftershocks. But it was interesting. I could go around and look at all these parking garages and other structures that were relatively modern, but were destroyed by this earthquake. So that was a real eye-opener, and engineers and building officials realized that there need to be changes in the building code, which they quickly implemented. Some of the scenes of the damage: collapse of highway sections, destroyed buildings, considerable devastation. But keep in mind, this did, in today's dollars, at most $100 billion in damage and kill 57 people. So these fires so far, they're not extinguished yet, have destroyed enough property. It's going to be hundreds of billions of dollars. And the latest death toll that I read was 27 people. So if you look at just the economic impacts of the Northridge quake and put it in perspective, these fires are going to have a far greater impact on the economy of California at the very least, if not the nation. And it's going to take months and years for any significant rebuilding effort to take place. So really, I'm thinking that the building code needs to change. There needs to be retrofitting of older structures that fall under older building codes. I mean, you look at the Francis Scott Key Bridge that was taken out last year. They're not going to rebuild it the exact same way. They're going to reduce the number of piers in the water so that there's fewer things out there that could get hit by a ship. They're going to move the piers farther away from the shipping channel. There's going to be much more effective pier protection, dolphins and that sort of thing. The dolphins were almost a joke at the Francis Scott Key Bridge compared to what you would typically expect would be needed for protection of an important bridge pier. And this last line here: design focus. The primary focus is to create a resilient bridge that can withstand potential ship collisions while maintaining functionality as a gateway to Baltimore. So again, they're going to make it resilient. And I've done videos about this I-40 mess in western North Carolina, and they built a fill section of highway for a distance of about 21 miles right next to the Pigeon River. Of course, with Hurricane Helene, the river was engorged and eroded out large sections of the highway. Well, apparently that section of highway is put in due to political pressures and not due primarily to engineering considerations. So does it make sense to rebuild the highway exactly the way it was before Helene occurred? And I don't think it does. And the reason I'm mentioning these projects, whether it's fires in Southern California, a bridge collapse, or major erosion of a highway embankment, we need to be thinking of these infrastructure projects as systems and what can be done to, well, this book here is about Antifragile, where things actually thrive from stress. I think for public infrastructure and housing and things like that, we should be happy with resiliency if we can get that at least. And one of the problems with looking at something from a system-wide basis is that in general, people are pretty bad at assessing risks. Insurance companies are much better at it, but in general, people tend to have a bias from their own experience. So if they haven't experienced a house fire or their neighborhood hasn't caught on fire, maybe their grandparents or great grandparents had that experience, but when it goes down to the individual living in current times, it's sort of a abstract concept. But in general, things that happen in the natural environment or even the man-made environment, if you look at so-called extreme events, they have a much higher probability of occurrence than what you would otherwise think from, say, a normal distribution. And that effect is called a fat-tailed distribution. And we can look at other potential hazards that in general are thought of as extreme events, but in actuality have a much higher probability of occurrence. And if they did occur, the severity of damage would be several orders of magnitude greater than what we've seen with these devastating fires in Southern California. So take, for example, the San Andreas Fault. In San Francisco alone, they're predicting over 10,000 deaths from a major earthquake on the San Andreas. Then you have the Cascadia subduction zone that can produce extremely high magnitude earthquakes. And all these cities, Seattle, Portland, Eugene, Medford, Cape Mendocino, they're all vulnerable to extensive damage from a major quake on Cascadia Fault. And then you've got Mount Rainier, just as another example. It could erupt at some point, and there are signs that the activity is increasing along Mount Rainier. And if that were to erupt, it would produce massive mud flows that would inundate many areas nearby in terms of cities and infrastructure and that sort of thing. Again, I think the system right now for fire protection has been optimized to firefighting and not fire prevention. And that's just from, a fire starting, they say, through lightning. You have bad actors out there that can increase the frequency and severity of these events as well. So right now for the Southern California fires, they're looking at power lines, hikers being careless, arson. There's been numerous reports of people setting additional fires once these fires had gotten started. And it just seems that, again, because of this bias towards assessing risk based on an individual's experience, there was a major fire in Belaire, California in 1962. And it is a carbon copy, although on a smaller scale, than what's happened right now in Southern California. And there's this film, there's a link in the description. CAL FIRE posted this a year ago about the Belaire fires. And the film's called Designed for Disaster. But they just show the dense development, all the people coming into Southern California, thousands and thousands of each year, in close proximity to all these wooded areas, heavily vegetated areas. And looks like old-timey equipment from the late 50s, early 60s. Hardly any personal protective gear here. There were 200 injuries, no deaths from this Belaire fire, and almost all of them were eye injuries from embers floating around in the air. But it's a remarkable video because essentially the system optimization hasn't changed in over 60 years, and that is it's biased towards active firefighting rather than prevention. And one of the things I mentioned with the insurance criteria they look at is vegetation. Unfortunately, in the mid-1800s during the California Gold Rush, apparently miners from Australia brought eucalyptus with them. And eucalyptus leaves are highly flammable. They contain a lot of oils. And Some people call eucalyptus trees gasoline trees for that reason. But they can burn explosively. And eucalyptus is very hard to kill. It can burn down or be chopped down to the roots, and it'll sprout a new trunk or multiple trunks. Anybody who's dealt with I had a couple year war with a mulberry tree that was growing along my fence line one time. And I didn't realize I kept chopping it down and it would grow back. And it took a gallon of Roundup to finally put an end to that mulberry tree. So there's tens of thousands, if not millions, of eucalyptus trees in this area of Southern California. And it's a bad actor relative to these fires. I know there's been portions of California that have looked to eradicate these eucalyptus trees. I think that should get strong consideration yet again throughout this whole area. So again, you've got all the mix of bad things where unfavorable vegetation, unfavorable high winds that are dry for this time of year, the Santa Anas. You've got people doing dumb things or criminal things to start or multiply these fires. So to sum it up, I think the future protection for residential areas in this portion of Southern California need to have much more of an engineering basis than a political basis. And people have to decide whether they can afford to implement these necessary measures to greatly decrease the fire risks for the type of construction they have on these homes. But the insurance companies are going to decide for people if these measures aren't implemented, unfortunately. And if nothing changes, the only people who can afford to live in such areas in the future will be the wealthy people, those that don't have to have insurance. They could be self-insured if they want and don't need a mortgage. So you can't get a mortgage unless you can get insurance. So that's going to rule out the middle class from living in these areas or coming back to these areas unless something on a fundamental basis is done to significantly reduce these fire risks. So let me know what you think in the comments section. I want to thank those of you who have bought me a coffee. I've got a link in the description. That's a great way to support the channel if you're so inclined. I also want to thank those of you who are channel members and those of you who provided super thanks. And also I want to thank those of you who have left comments throughout the time I've been posting videos. The comments here are fantastic and at a very high level. I learn a lot from the comments that people leave to these videos. So I very much appreciate that. Please stay tuned for future videos. I got a lot of new interesting topics coming up.